Graduate Design Reviews, and it's great to have Jeff come back to review the work and to see the work of students. It's of course a program that he initiated some years ago, and it's wonderful to have him back. The work of Jeff Kipnis, I think, its relationship to architecture originally has been from the margins. It's had a tangential relationship initially, trying to really get at certain conventions of contemporary architectural practice. And I think he's done some incredible work originally. One can notice that over the last few years, his work has now moved from this idea of operating from the margins to try and actually work very much with the conventions of architectural practice. But because of the very nature of Jeff's criticism and his involvement, I think it's almost impossible for that work to be naturalized, to be, in a sense, become conventionalized, in the sense that there is a tendency for certain conventions to lead to conventionality. And I think this is something that we all have to be grateful for. It really somehow establishes a condition of destabilization for all our work. So I would like you to join me in welcoming Jeff Kipnis, who's going to tell us tonight what he's been doing and what he's been thinking about. Yes, what he's been thinking about and what he's been doing. Join me in welcoming Jeff Kipnis. Thank you.
Sound? You want sound? Have you got sound now? Well, then how are you answering me? Sorry, an old gag. Don't worry about the sound. I'm not going to say that much. I'm just going to show some old man's pictures. I have lectured, I think, a lot in this room. Mark, maybe a little bit more. But let me thank, obviously, Moisen and Brett and Patrick and Michael, also the students of the Graduate Design Program. This is the third year I've been through candidates. It's been exciting and frustrating, and I owe great debt both to the institution and to the students that I've participated with. I want to make one other thank you, and that's to Greg Lynn. When I started in architecture, I think I go through the same pattern everybody else does. I had heroes, Peter Eisenman, and you go study with your hero. Very quickly, your discourse moves away from learning about that to learning about your colleagues, people of your own generation. So Mark Wigley, Beatrice, a whole generation of thought that you identify with and you develop and you put yourself in relationship to. But I remember a particular experience I had at Peter's office when Greg was working there. And Greg was at Princeton. I always thought Greg was this real geek at Princeton. He hung around with I don't know. I always, I thought, this kid's going to go nowhere. And so I had a talk with him at Peter's office, and we were talking about semiotics or signs and the work, and he was working on the Cincinnati project. And I realized that all of a sudden, instead of me talking to him, a generation speaking to a student, I was listening to him. That what he was saying to me was more interesting than what I said to him. And he was talking about, the end of the production of meaning and the bankruptcy of this and that, and the importance of topology. And I thought, this is incredibly interesting stuff. And at my next lecture, I said it all except in my own name. And I thought, what was important, and the point I want to make was that for the first time I realized that a generation younger than me was influencing me in a way that I was, no longer interested in the work of my colleagues. And since that time, it's kind of exciting. First it's a little off-putting, and then it's kind of exciting. That you realize you can steal from anybody. They don't have to be old. So the world opens up, and that's why it's good to teach. So thank you, Greg. I've written, there's a lot of, I'm one of these, I'm interested in everything, there's never a project I've seen that I can really say I truly don't like, although by the time you're in public, you have to find some to say you like and some you don't like. And, every time I read a theory, I think, yes, that's right, that's right, that's right, that everything is right. So I can't tell you everything I'm thinking about and doing. There's stuff going on now in architecture, which is, I believe, a debate between an infrastructural approach to architecture and what I call a garden approach, which is basically, is architecture a performative discipline or a visual discipline? And you can read about this in an essay I wrote on REM. And there's theoretical stuff. Tonight I'm going to try to just tell you sort of what I'm thinking about doing in terms of working as a designer. Now, it's a funny thing I don't think of myself as a designer. I think of myself as a kind of undercover agent in design. I think design is kind of criminal activity that no one will go expose. So I do design to figure out what these criminals do, how they get away with it. And then I'm looking for the day I can kind of come tell you the truth, tell on the designers. So for a long time I worked with Bahram Sherdel to try to figure out how it worked, and the firm was called Sherdel Kipnis. It was really Sherdel et al. And I was Al. And now I'm on my own, and all the work you'll see tonight, finally I can say, I'm responsible for. The interesting thing is I cannot draw anything, I cannot make a model, I cannot run a computer. So all the work I claim authorship over, but I've not done one iota of it. But I've learned that that's another, kind of way you can take credit. So as a result, there's a lot of people, I'm not going to name them all, that have actually executed the work, and I appreciate that. And when the work gets published, I hope they'll get appropriate credit. Thank you, Mark. A few years ago, I wrote an essay called Toward a New Architecture. I was very proud of the essay for two reasons. One, it was the first piece ever written in architecture which was actually entitled Toward a New Architecture, as opposed to being a mistranslation of Toward an Architecture. So I wrote Toward a New Architecture, and I was pleased to be able to take credit for that. And in it, I laid out some criteria, general criteria for architecture, for a new architecture. And they were pointing, vast, blank, incongruent, and coherent. Now, those particular criteria actually came from another philosopher or legal theorist, Roberto Unger, who took a look at architecture at the request of the NE group and suggested 4 out of 5 of those. The only one he changed, he had incongruent and incoherent. And after discussions with Greg, I was interested in the idea that you could achieve incongruence but coherence, that you're looking for organizations of difference that nevertheless pull together into a kind of complex, I wouldn't say a unity, but that a coherence, that the postmodern period that saw both incoherence and incongruence as a positive project had missed the possibility of investigating new kinds of order that would come from incongruence and coherence. So the work had to do with putting forward these criteria and then trying to figure out how to turn the criteria into architecture. So I thought it would be useful to put the criteria forward. It provided critical tools for me to assess other works. I hoped it might stimulate some architects to think about their own work. But also, I felt like I was interested in seeing, given these broad criteria, how does one move towards an architecture from those? And that's what I want to discuss tonight. But just in one more bit of prelude, the thing that I didn't anticipate was how much anxiety there was over the notion of new. What I kept saying, what is the new? I kept hearing, you want to do a new architecture. Why new? New was a discredited notion. For example, all of postmodernism really moved away from a modern tabula rasa notion of the new. So there was this real, not attack, but a demand made upon me to answer the question, 2 questions, why do the new? And what do you mean by the new? And I gave some time to reflect on that. And I found the best answer. I don't usually like to say I found the best answer. I found the best answer in Deleuze. I'm not a reader of Deleuze. I find his work difficult to understand, but particularly generous in the sense that just about any idea you want, he provides you a quote to support. So it's quite a useful bathroom book. But he said, the point of new theories is not to produce new justifications, but new sensibilities. Now, I was quite intrigued with that because basically most of us had used new theories to produce new justifications. If you read, and this is no criticism of that, but if you read Rosalind Krauss or Beatrice Colomina, Mark Wigley, what's interesting is that they have a strong command of new theoretical technique, but they go back and valorize exactly the same figures, so Rosalind Krauss manages to take a powerful command of new theoretical technique and end up continuously rejustifying the same post-minimalist that she was always interested in. However, this idea that the real goal would be to produce new sensibilities intrigued me. What is a new sensibility? It's not new meanings. It's not, a new world is not a place where, it's not the same world except old meanings have changed to new meanings. A new world is not the same world except old forms have changed to new forms. So the notion of a sensibility for me was more powerful than the question of new meanings, and I say this, for example, in relationship to Charles Jenks's interest in the new sciences, an application of new scientific ideas or new ideas of knowledge. To produce a new sensibility was really to effect a change in the world, and it would not be, you could not synonymize it with, make it synonymous with produce new meanings in a semiotic sense or semantic sense or new forms or new organizations. There was something quite vague about it, and in that sense, a sensibility would not allow itself to be partitioned into the set of categories that we normally like to think of when we think about the architectural effects. That is either performative, meaning, or aesthetic, and in particular, aesthetic. So what is a new sensibility? I mean, what is new and what is a new sensibility? Or I turn the question, what is the new, to what do you mean by new sensibilities? And there have been many approaches to this problem, new forms and new performatives. I think the most productive, though, have fallen into two groups. One is the situationist approach. And essentially what that approach is, you pay careful attention to discredited experiences to see if they have in fact taken on a new life. And a good example, and I think most of you will be familiar with, is generally you don't like to walk in the front of a theater anymore. You don't like the entry sequence which takes you from the outside to the inside, presents the proscenium to you, puts you on an aisle, set of curtain risings, puts you in a seat. If you walk in the back of the theater, there's a kind of visceral material confusion, your sense of not having to be staged. So the back of the theater, the kind of junk, is more interesting in a certain way than the front, or processional, which has been valorized over a number of years. And situationist technique allowed us to go back and re-examine some of these experiences and essentially rehabilitate discredited or unrecognized valuable experiences and turn them into technique. Rem Koolhaas's notion of bigness, for example, is an example of that. The other one, though, I thought was more interesting is to meditate on new sensibilities by looking at emergent sensibilities, spontaneous convergences of sensible qualities in material or formal or organizational, in fashion, in advertising, in wherever you saw it. So the architect's effort to detect an emergent sensibility in that sense was slightly different from the situationist, and that's the one I was most interested in pursuing. And in that sense, what I'm going to show you tonight is simply that. I was interested in the question, how do I take these 5 criteria, vast, blank, pointing, congruent, and incoherent, and look to architecturalize those, find a technique to make architecture or design from them, and at the same time attend a kind of emergent sensibility. And the emergent sensibility I call, or has been called, Toyo Ito before me, liquid space. The notion that modern, for example, modernism was not vast space, it was infinite space. So getting under the ocean and looking. Imagine yourself in a huge ocean, to speak to Tom and Michael. And what is that space? For example, if you're under the water and you have no perspective, you have not infinite, you have vast distances, but is it a claustrophobic space or an agoraphobic space? It's both closed and open at the same time. So there's a whole new quality to what happens in liquid space. And you see it in advertising, you see it in the Anderson ad, you see it in Terminator 2, you see it in certain fashion designs, you see a kind of sensibility about liquidity, which I was fascinated by. Now, for me, the problem is slightly different than, I think Greg's portrayal of it in terms of single surface theory last night was compelling. I'm not quite sure convincing is the word, but certainly compelling. The difference I have is that you also have to respect a certain architectonic tradition. So you're looking for new sensibilities, but the translations have to also recognize how does architecture have an effect. And one of its most important ways is to establish the terms of the real. The real, and I don't mean this in a phenomenological sense, I mean the real, architecture is able to fabricate the real. It also can drift into the irreal. And this is quite interesting. Drive-it, IFAS, drywall, these are, a long time ago, what's that stuff that ersatz material? No, the one that's, they used to put wood grain in and yeah, Formica. All of these materials create the sense of the irreal. You have to be careful. And if you go out to Canary Wharf, for example, and this is not, again, not a phenomenology, because the use of teak and ebony can also be irreal. So Canary Wharf for me is not architectural production of the real. It has drifted into the irreal. So I think you have to pay very strong attention to at what point you cross a boundary in architecture, which means that you have to be devoted to the Cartesian in some sense. Not just translate the topological into the Cartesian, but recognize that the Cartesian has a very powerful effect. Anyway, that's the theory. That's it. That's the end of the talk. I'm not going to show you some pictures. Part of it's a videotape, and part of it's some stills. So let me run the videotape. To make a long story short, I'm interested in liquid space, and as you'll see from the video, not only am I interested in liquid space, I'm interested in a particular episode of it, which I call the School of Fish, and I call it the School of Fish because it's about schools of fish. So the name worked quite well. Now I'm going to run the video and I'll try to comment on it. Remember now, I'm looking at this and I'm going to see if I can turn it into architecture, not just stop. This has got nothing to do with School of Fish or anything else. I just think, now that is a good project, right? So, all right. So can you back up and run that scene just 1 second? Okay. Now this is the two kinds of, go ahead. Okay, keep going. Forward, Joel. Okay, this is David's space from that nice project. Here's the two kinds of space I'm interested in. The liquid space established by a very large object floating in space, or the reactive school around it. This is the history of recent architecture, postmodernism. Bright colors, interesting forms. This is sort of Anderson and that little shop down the street, or Terry Farrell, Michael Graves. So you have to kind of not just make architecture, not turn this into architecture, but recognize that it's already architecture. Okay, so this is the postmodern period. This is the deconstructed part of postmodernism. And then we get into we'll see a bit of neo-modernism, which I think is important to recognize. It's a nice little project, yeah. Okay. Now, I was not interested in objects and colors, because you do not see liquid space in any of this. You see a fascination with form and material and color. There's space. So space is a void. It's vast. It's blank. But it's not the same thing as modern space. It's not infinite, undifferentiated. Now, here comes Greg's projects. This is the big object. So there's the church. There's the Korean church. And then if you back up, just back up 1 second. Quick, if you look at the fins, you can see briefly the Vienna. Go ahead. But this is the big object floating in the space. Now, this next thing, I have no idea why I filmed this. It's just so gross, I just thought you'd like to see it. You know, I mean, this is so gross. It's like okay, schools of fish. Now, they're highly dynamic, they're reactive, they're particularly sensitive to changes in their contingent context. They're hierarchical, but they don't have fixed hierarchy, so they're provisionally hierarchical. They establish a space in both formal terms and material terms. They produce transparencies and translucencies. You see through them, you see them. So the school of fish effect is the one for me that most attends a new sensibility. So multiple things in fast motion, creating interrupted transparency in vast space. Now I thought I needed a picture of Corbusian modernism, so this is the Tower in the Park scheme. Just to show you can discover all architectures underwater. There it is, vast infinite space with Ville Radius organization. It's a kind of creepy place, you know. All right. I'm going to keep going because I want to show you here's some more schooling properties. So you can see that they hold a form, and it's not about the edge condition. It's about both multiple objects. Now, they tend to have to be the same, but we'll look into that situation. But also the way they interrupt, they both act as form, but they act as material. They're transparent, translucent. They interrupt the visual, but at the same time, they don't block it. They're not opaque. So as you go in them, they produce a density and organized space, and they're contingently responsive again to their context. So I've been studying more and more and more schools of fish. It turns out that it's not just schools of fish, it's schools, swarms, and flocks. Flocking, schooling, and swarming is the title of the mathematical paper which has been examining these kinds of organizational effects. And that mathematical paper was produced by Industrial Light and Magic and given it both the SIGGRAPH and the Mathematical Society of America. So Hollywood's special effects is producing a kind of mathematics of flocking schools of fish. And I'll try to show you one scene where it works. Okay. A little bit more. See, this is spectacular. You can see all of it here. The transparency, the contingency, the dynamics, provisional hierarchy, the multiple parts and highly communicative relationships, the edge conditions, fast responses, deep space, but at the same time not undifferentiated vacuum. Okay, it's only a few minutes more. Yeah, it's there too. Congruence. No, don't fast forward. I don't have that long a lecture, so I kind of need this. Okay, the isolated object floating in space was the old way I approached the problem, which is in the NAR competition, for example, large sectional objects floating in space to essentially sandwich you in liquid space has given way in the work to this school of fish, or liquid space sensibility. Now, there's two more. You can go forward now to the fats. Good. I don't know. I get really excited when I see this, and I think, God, if I could make an architecture that does that and looks like that, I would be really excited. But it also gives me a new understanding, for example, of Seijima. So the multiple forms of translucency, transparency, the use of perforated metal, it creates a space, a sensibility about space, which I identify. The refractions, light effects. So in a certain sense, I was kind of interested in what Terry wrote in the light construction show, but it only understood one level of change from translucency to transparency or the veil. Because I don't think those terms, opacity, translucency, and transparent. Now here's the bats. This is flocking. This is in China, and you'll see that the bats hold a form in space because they hold the edge, unlike a thermodynamic group, and that they are constantly responding to micro changes in the contingency. So this is the flocking scene. And I don't know if you can see it, but the form folds back on itself. Well, you'll see. It almost looks like the finger of God from the Ten Commandments. I don't know if you remember that scene. Now, and here's a nice representation of what I believe is the kind of vast transparency that schools and swarms and flocks are able to do. So you can see, if you look at the monk and the scientist talking to each other in the bats, you can see that there's a real change in the way transparency operates. Now, the point will be here not to put, now here's this is flocking, this is the flocking program from Jurassic Park. It'll fade in and out because of the copy protect mechanism, and I'll just show you can fast forward a little bit. I mean, I just wanted to show you, this is the program they wrote to capture the effect, flocking effect. They come up the hill. He is an incredibly bad actor. They're flocking, he says. And they're flocking this way, he says. And then here they come. Okay, you can cut it off now. I like Hollywood. All right, so now I'm going to show you 4 projects at 4 different scales: posters, furniture, building, and a city. I've done half a dozen cities, so I just picked one to show you. This undercover work is really exciting. Don Bates and I designed a poster for the graduate design, the first graduate design poster, and it was the first idea of liquid space. It was, I don't know if you can see it, this is black. You can see that, right? Okay. But raised as embossing are the letters, which you can barely see. But it set a kind of notion of space in which things were floating, not schooling, but very much in the sense of establishing one undifferentiated space and then floating objects in it. So this was 3 years ago, before I started to work on the school. This is the first kind of idea that we would try to do. Okay, so let me go to the first slide, and then I'll show you where we go from here. Reverse, forward. Okay, this is the last project Bahram and I did together. This is my version of the shark or the whale floating in liquid space. We did a lot of sectional objects. What we were never able to do was to quite get the kind of interrupted transparency, the sense of liquidity. So we got as far as this model, where the plexiglass model was supposed to produce the sense of liquidity in which the object floated. I think it works at the level of the model. We never were able to figure out how to take it to a next step in the architecture. That must have been reverse. Oh no, blank slide, blank slide. Okay, so this is a poster, 2 posters I've designed. This is it's not out of focus. It's actually in focus. But the idea was to give up the question of simple legibility. But the other thing is, graphics designs are still laying objects and letters in a flatbed space. So they're still in the sensibility of collage. So they're interested in incongruence and incoherence, but there's a definite definable space and there's a definable object. Sometimes they fit together, sometimes they lay on top of each other. What I want to do, next slide, okay, is to make it impossible to say where does the letter begin, where does the space end. So the space and the letter are the same, or in an effort to be the same. There's also a joke in these posters about old movies. This is Superman, this is the Superman perspective, now underwater. Next, This is the next poster. And this, the joke, the old movie joke, and this is voice to the bottom. Let's see. I don't know if you recognize the graphic. Next slide. But in this case, what we did was, this is a letter. I don't know if you can see it. The space and the letter are composed out of exactly the same pixelated structure. And so, back up one. I'll do my own to go back up this one. So, I think the letter, so there is no graphic space which things lay in, therefore to either make incongruent or not. It's one coherent system in which incongruent but coherence can occur. Next. Okay, I'm in charge. I'll let you dwell on that for a moment. Okay. The next thing is the furniture. Now, if you have a new idea of space, one of your obligations is to show how to display objects in a space. So if you look at, for example, Adolf Loos or Eileen Gray, as they were exploring the space of modernism, they built display cabinets, generally cubic grid structures, in which highly differentiated objects sat in a gridded field. They're really spectacularly beautiful. So what I wanted to do was produce a school of fish display technique, which would hold its edge, be multiply composite, and highly dynamic. Next. So each of these pieces, you can reform you can make it sculptural, or you can make it display. You can each one is you can locate it in hand by hand. There's a little bar there with 2 screws and piano wire. There's a grid of holes at the top, a grid of holes at the bottom, and the floor, so you can change the piano wire configuration and establish the school of fish. Use it as a sculptural element, as a space divider, or as a display system. So I thought it was important to figure out how do you display objects and what is the tectonics of the school of fish that's completely consistent with architectural tectonics. There are no curved lines. Each element repeats itself. It's modular. So this resolution of a sensibility which does not come from architecture, with not leaving the real, not venturing into the irreal, is to try to work out how that would work in this project. Next. Now I do next. Okay, one of the most interesting moments, and I don't know if you remember, is when a school of fish gives way. So a seal goes through it. So it's an incredibly interesting, responsive moment. So I just wanted to make a case where you could make the school give way to objects as a display, so they can be displayed to front and back or in this fashion. And then finally, without a contingent condition in the context, they don't take on a form, so they establish a space, and you can just set your cameras on them. So my first effort at furniture. Furniture is really exciting, and I want to do more of it. Cities, cities are kind of easy. This is my entry for the Kansai competition. Now, again, it'll show the old research into a sectional object, which tries to establish the quality of the space. I wanted to win this competition absolutely desperately. So I thought I'm going to make this easy to build, very Cartesian in its organization, simple, beautiful. I'm going to suck up to the Japanese. These are all famous Japanese writers and authors. It has ABA organization, because of the Japanese imperial style. I did everything I could to win this thing. I was in Bangkok waiting to get my prize. And I called Beverly and said, have they said I won yet? I said I won yet. And finally she said, you didn't hear anything. And I kept trying to jump out of this tower from the 10th floor, but you couldn't open the window. So next. So, I do next. So the School of Fish thing the idea was to allow the letters to float in space and to use the several conditions of transparency, translucency, essentially to reproduce the visual space that starts not only with the floating, but the whole sense of the vitreous quality of the space. Now, as you're rethinking, as you begin to examine a new sensibility, things happen intellectually that I think are interesting. For one thing, I've always been interested in the Tugendhat house because it was the only place where Mies tried to, I don't know if you know this, but it has a glass wall that rolls up and rolls down. So in the summer, the glass wall rolls down, and in the winter, because he thought glass at that point was simply to represent void, so I don't need it in the summer, I can get rid of it, and I can bring it back in the winter. And then he never repeated it again. So this notion that glass represents void in Mies is wrong. Even though he pursued the widest glass, that is the least reflective glass, in his work all the way up to and including the Farnsworth house, he never repeated again this idea that you could remove the glass. Or glass became an important issue in the architecture as such. So the vitreous quality, not because it's reflective as it is in Philip Johnson's house, but because it has a vitreous quality, it has a quality, a true architectural quality, and he never again experimented with removing the glass. And so as one begins to explore a new sensibility, you begin to rethink old architectural tropes. My favorite is, I never understood, the most banal and idiotic thing I ever heard from architectural history was the interest that Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier and others had in ocean liners. And you always hear that they liked the way it sort of represented a kind of streamlined modernism to them. And I thought these guys are smarter than that. They do work that's better than that. I never understood why they were interested in ocean liners until I realized that they're not interested in the semiotic or symbolic quality. What they're interested in is if you see an ocean liner out on the ocean in this sort of transitional condition between infinite space and the space of the ocean, it is a powerful spatializing effect. It's not a symbolic effect. It's not representative. It's about the ability of a certain kind of device to create a spatial effect. And I think what they're really hoping to do was to let that device recapitulate that space in their projects. So, and they have an interesting attitude about the ground. They never do gardens. They treat the ground as an ocean. And so I'm actually quite interested in going back now and writing a sort of revisiting of both the Tugendhat house and the use of ocean liner imagery in modernism, because these architects who I love so much, it no longer seems trivial to me. It seems to make sense. Here you can see all the kinds of the vitreous liquid quality of the space. So the letters act as a school of fish, but the multiplying forms of translucency try to capture the visual space. There's the black object sits in this, this is the entry. I just shot myself with a laser in the heart. Wait, okay. The black object, in order to walk from one, it penetrates here, but when you pull that out and you see that, it's so good. I mean, it's just so great, I just wanted to show you this line. Not that I'm particularly fond of my own work or anything like that, but okay. You want to here? So sorry. Okay. This is Bangkok in 1888. Bangkok. This is the Chao Phraya River. This is this farmland is the site deeded to the university, Chulalongkorn University, and all of these things are irrigation canals and canals. Bangkok essentially was called the Venice of Asia, and essentially built on water. In 1960, an American named Litchfield was asked to make suggestions for a city planning. He said, fill in all the canals and prepare for the car, for streets. So they did. And basically, I used to think this was true, whatever you suggest to the people in Thailand, they say, okay, they do. Turned out not to be quite as true as I thought, but so they slowly but surely Bangkok turned from a land, next slide, or I do the next one. Okay. This is the floodplain. This is the Chao Phraya River. There's the exact site I just showed you. There's the farmland. All of this is floodplain. So once a year, every place you see black and blue, it's underwater. Now, so fighting this much flood is a kind of, I don't know where Litchfield was thinking about, but they do. So this little green now is, I'm sorry, this much green is how much they're able to keep dry now with flood control. But it's basically a place where liquid and water makes a big difference, and it was kind of crucial to my project. Now, let me back up. The project is on this site. Now, this is the university. What's happened, of course, is, as you know from Bangkok, it's chaos. It's absolutely utter chaos. No planning, no building codes, no coherence at all. So at one time I was interested in working there because I was interested in this kind of chaotic condition. When I got there, I became interested in how do you give them any kind of sense of order? You know, it's pointless to go there and say, I'm going to teach you about chaotic conditions. since they think, huh? And so this is the site. Right there. It's and this is the university. You can begin to recognize the grid. When you see that, that is that. It's actually not that, but it's close enough. Now, it's a big site. It's 40. As you can see, it's 43 blocks of Manhattan. So each one of these is the St. Patrick's Cathedral block of Manhattan. So it's 43 blocks of Manhattan. It's a lot of stuff to put into a single project. It was 20 million square feet or 2 million square meters of building. And what they asked is a concept, a planning and design concept. The only thing that's memorable in Bangkok is one of the most exciting cities. It's got every kind of architectural experimentation, every kind of material experimentation. But it's very much like a fisherman's platter. You know, when you're a kid and you go to a restaurant and you think, well, I don't know what to order, so I order a fisherman's platter. It's got a little bit of everything on it, you know. And what you remember at the end of it is fried. You know, you don't remember that you've actually eaten anything. Or you buy a greatest hits album and you don't hear anything, but, you know, it's the 40s. And when you go to Bangkok, you have no memory of anything except the temples because they're large, they're highly coherent and highly congruent. It's pointless to compete at the level of height or the level of scale or the level of exotic form to create any identity. Now, this site is owned by the university. It's going to be commercial and residential. It's strictly for the development is developer driven. We had to plan for developers to come in, make it attractive to developers. The point of the project is strictly to provide money for the university. However, in order to get the king's blessing, since this is a king-deeded site, it has to be dedicated to the king, so there has to be symbolic representation of the king. Okay, so we won the competition. We won the short, limited competition to do the project. And what happened was, in the first phase, we lost, and another team from France lost, called VNF. We meaning Space Group of Korea, and myself as design consultant. But then we were told if we would team up with the Space Group of Korea, if Space Group of Korea would team up with VNF, Ville Nouvelle Francais, we would be allowed to be in the second phase. So we teamed up and we won. Now you have to find out, this is a very funny situation. Ville Nouvelle Francais is filled with French people, and they are arrogant jerks who won't listen to anything. Honest to God, I don't want to, it was, anyway, so there's me consulting in English with my Korean partners who don't speak English, French, or Thai. Our partners, our planning, they were supposed to do the planning, we were supposed to do the design. Our partners spoke French. They could also speak English, but of course it would be a step down in their cultivated life. Our Thai partners never show up because they get 51% of the budget whether they come or not, so we never met them actually. So it's me working with the Koreans and the French and then presenting our projects to people that only speak Thai. That was the situation. Why they thought this would work, I don't know, but that was the. So I'm now to give you a sense of the scale. It's this big. If you limit it to the program, this is as much as fabric of New York as you'd need to finish out the 20 million square feet. So this gives you, on the one hand, how big it is. The program is equivalent to 50 20-story towers. When I did this model, this is a funny thing, use of the word "I" there. When I caused this model to be done, I thought a couple things. I finally figured out how REM works. We're finished, but what am I going to do for the next 8 months? I kind of like the project, but anyway. So we're just giving you a sense of scale, and I was trying to give them the sense of the scale. The other thing is that it's exactly the same size as Kansai Airport. Kansai Airport fits exactly on the site just like this. And so it's either a lot of New York or 20 towers or one big terminal. So, in fact, the notion of architectural scale today, I don't really know how you figure out what the right size of something is. We had to reduce, Kansai actually fills the site. The building actually fills the site. We actually had to reduce it to make it look plausible, because when you actually put it at its right scale, you don't even get the fingers. The building is actually the same size as the site. So that's the real size. This is a pin. No, yeah. Now, this is a pin. I now have shot myself in the heart twice. So this is the real size of the site, but we wanted these fingers to look like we were making connections to the city. I did this. I said, I like this too. We can, why can't this be the project? So let's see what my next slide is. Okay, so we went to a presentation, and we were supposed to have worked with Ville Nouvelle Francais together. So they were going to show their planning ideas. We were going to show our design ideas. They were supposed to be coordinated as a team. They refused to talk to us. In my generosity, I really wanted to talk to them. I asked them many times if they would join us in our project. Somehow I wasn't able to convince them I was sincere. So we showed up at the first presentation to show our combined efforts. And this is what they showed. This was their idea. We were asked to make a new and unique order for the university. This was the French idea of a new and unique order. This part was provided, the axis and this green strip was provided by the university. So this is basically their idea. Put a hole in it, I guess, and some colored blocks. I never quite figured out their idea, but I'll show you. So this is what they presented, This graphics is important because you'll see it come back later. This was their planning idea. You don't have to read all this stuff. This was my partner, and this was their model. So, and their idea was, okay, we finished all the planning and design. Now we'll just refine it. At the same presentation, this was our first image, and I'm up there saying this has already been coordinated with the VNF. It's completely consistent with the VNF scheme. This is the first thing I'm saying but you can see I'm trying to find a way to get a kind of high level of liquid coherence on the site. So this is a concept drawing, and through a set of steps, we try to take it to a possible project. So this is a conceptual model, which differentiates the public space. Each one of these would have been a building. For me, it gave a very high level of coherence. It's quite incongruent in its relationship to the site. But it also established, the idea would be to make something that was memorable by using the scale, by making something that held together at that scale. So this was the first month of the project. From then on, it had to do with negotiating among VNF and ourselves and the ties. And I'll skip a lot of that, but I kind of just show you where the project went. This is my favorite moment in the project. And I still think this is both practical and realizable. Although it's true that they're kind of big buildings. It turned out we found out that the developers in Thailand are used to 2,000 square meter or 20,000 square foot floor plates. Somebody talked a developer into trying a 30,000 square foot floor plate, and he couldn't rent one. So it's highly inflexible to changes in certain kinds of parameters that developers are used to. So we went through a whole number of steps where we broke it up, and we tried to keep the formal quality and spatial quality. We added a gardening system which was derived from mortar symbolism. VNF said no, doesn't coordinate with our plan. After a long series of time, this is where we ended up, where I thought we were finished. So, now the axis, which doesn't exist, but that the university thinks exists, is really important. So we We gestured every building toward the axis. One thing I should say is, one thing that enabled me to go from the first model to this model is a project by Greg that he did at Cabrini Green, where he just showed how very high levels of coherence could be achieved with simple formal mechanisms in the building arrangement. I couldn't find the slide. I would have liked to have showed it to you. It has a material idea. This is the worst part of the site in terms of the land values. So we use the symbolic reference of the king to raise the land values here, and we try to keep a kind of coherence in the form. And then this project, this part of the project, let me back up. This part of the project, or that model, but this drawing, let's say, gets stepped on to the point of just being plinths, little entry plinths for the building. So it's still in the project. It's not in there, but it's still, these plinths now take on the formal language of that first model. These are developer-friendly buildings with slight material changes. Still, there was an enormous resistance to this because of this unusual wing shape and the fact that, I mean, why waste that much space? Why not make these all tall? You know, why give up that much revenue? There's no way to get the people to change materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so this is kind of where we got to. Then, so here you can see the plinths that retain the liquid formal quality, and the buildings came out of. This was rejected as being impossible to build and impractical. By the way, there's the geometry. And then I'll show you, we worked out the specific details of how the landscaping and the tectonic quality of the plinths would meet. So that's the plinth geometry, that's the landscape geometry. This is it's not a layering. This is where we're studying the intersection of the two in order to produce this kind of tectonic landscape, which combines both the plinths, how the plinths meet the building, and the landscaping system, with ground lighting and a kind of continuous movement from tectonic space, landscape space into the buildings. It seemed too complex for them, so I'm now building this as a garden in my backyard, having been inspired by Charles Jenks's have a big idea and then put it in a garden in your backyard. So this was rejected as impossible to do. In order to symbolize the king, we took that last tectonic landscape and we developed it into a sort of a space in which materials, lighting effects, there's no building, but lighting effects and the geometry would become realized into a kind of public zone and space and covered walkways, a kind of event space. They absolutely not. The symbolism of the king had to be derived from the existing royal symbol of the king. So I was obligated to design a monument to the king of Thailand, which I did. This is my monument to the king of Thailand. It's these are the 5 elements in Buddhist philosophy. It's also derived from his symbol, which is a circle and a kind of peak. I don't know if you know, this is a very famous can opener. Have you seen you can go buy one of these. Actually, I like it. I mean, it's the first sort of lyrical, symmetrical thing I've ever done. It has a nice circle in it. Okay, so put it on the site. We're told to get rid of the plinths. So there's now the landscaping. Those are the buildings. Remember the French graphics, the color coding graphics? Thank you. Michael, leave me alone, will you?
I have a question related to the issue of I have a question related to the issue, or probably it's more some kind of remark to the issue of incongruence. If you allow to replace this term for a moment by dissimilarity, when you discuss the kind of swarming effect as a kind of graphic or as a spatial effect, with let's say a group of fish as a number of objects, or a group of shelves as a number of objects, it seems that the issue of incongruence needs to be modified in such a way that on a macroscopic level it seems to be almost necessary to have a certain kind of similarity, congruence, to achieve the effect of coherence, and on a microscopic level almost to have dissimilarities to achieve the sort of spatial effect of heterogeneity, which is quite precisely shown in terms of the letters, which they somehow have all the same size and sort of the same composure, but they're all different. But I think where there was a certain kind of disbalance that makes this modification quite evident was when the bottles and the vases were placed on the shelf, because there is all of a sudden a macroscopic kind of dissimilarity between the objects, which basically comes back to the effect of collage, of incoherence. Would you agree to that?
One of the secrets I learned about designers is that there's absolutely no consistency between what they say they're trying to do and what they're doing. And that's not, I used to think we should try to correct that, you know. When I look at the work, I see coherence and incongruence. When I think about the work, it's not there.
But does the shelf then take...
By the way, that's the first thing I've ever done in wood. I hate wood. Y'all know I have a kind of rule against wood. So the shelves, it's kind of breakthrough for me to work in wood. You know, wood is such a... It's dead. You know, I never could figure out why anybody would want to put dead stuff in their house. But
I'm just wondering, you know, I think the shelf works extremely well, but don't you need to kind of...
I mean, I know you're asking something that's... First of all, you've hit on something right. I think in terms of the production of the real, architectural congruence depends on repetition of the same element. I think that's true. I think you can make spaces that are coherent, that are tolerant of incongruent intrusions, like the bottles or like the glasses. And for me, that's adequate. And also, I think if you look in the, I start in the urban project, everything is the same. And you get the highest level of coherence and congruence by doing that. But you can introduce very strong levels of difference and obey and not break, not drift into at least not drift into a kind of collage which celebrates the incongruence or incoherence, and still introduce high levels of difference in materiality in the form. Although it becomes, you end up repeating some fairly well-known organizational types. I don't know, so you're right, it's true. More interesting to me is this work getting a sensibility? Is it feeling, feeling is not the right word. Am I producing a sense of liquidity and school of fish or schooling that is consistent with what I believe to be an emergent sensibility? And I think that's yes. So it's true that I set out to try to pointing blank. I can give you a description of each of those criteria, but let's say that's the point I started, that's not the question of the thing. I think it's no longer the test of the work for me.
Sorry.
Jeff, one of the last times I've heard the new sensibility defended was Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp. And what she did there was in 1966, so it's been a long time since someone's come out. What she said was sensibility is the most ephemeral of all categorizations. And it's usually not captured in writing or in exhibitions or anything, but it's the most vital thing about a period in many ways, this intangible thing. It's a category that doesn't seem to fall into other categories. And you more or less said part of that today. But what's strange is that when you show it and when you talk about it, you also use aesthetic categories and like liquidity. And the two aspects of this that interest me. One is, what's the relation between a sensibility and a cognitive structure or invention in a paradigm? Because that's the part that interests me partly, and I wonder where they overlap. You in your writing seem to defend the notion of fashion as important for emergence. Can't remember what the other thing is. Come to me when you answer the first.
Two questions. I mean, I think fashion is extremely important because it is a conspicuous emergent phenomenon. The notion that anyone's ever in control of fashion or is able to predict or master fashion is absolutely not true. And therefore, when a large number of people become interested, people have been seeing, for example, schools of fish for a long time, or whatever, liquid for a long time. And so to see so many designers all of a sudden spontaneously interested in the effect. Now, you have to remember, for example, let's say in special effects in films, for a long time, interest is driven by technology. So if you look at the 3 periods of special film effects, there was it's called the candy apple period, where everything was shiny and neon. Then there's the ATO period. Then there's the liquid space period, because new programs enable the effect. And now there's the photoreal period. So if you look at the stylistic or fashion periods in film effects, it really has to do with the available technology. At some point in architecture and fashion design, has been at that point for a long time, the technology is pretty much complete. There are new technologies, CAD and CAM, but technology is no longer driving sensibility. So this is when design as an independent practice and a discipline emerges. So I would not talk about film effect designers, because they're just driven by the technology. So fashion is important because only emergence and the theories of emergence like complexity theory do a very good job, and it's indicative of a sensibility. So the other thing is it's not yet unfoldable, it's not yet exfoliable into any kind of semiotic decoding. One cannot explain, one cannot decode it. So it's a phenomenon which is ahead of decoding, and therefore, most important to me, it's not about reading. I'm not against readings. I'm not against the operation of meanings in architecture. But I am against a period which has decided that codes and coding theory and critical theory is all architectural is, or all cultural practices are the productions of meanings. And I don't think that's true, and I think what we need to do is continuously look for conditions of underdetermination, not overdetermination.
Why don't you, though, show others who share this sensibility? In other words...
Because I'm by myself. I'm unique in that regard.
But the thing about Notes on Camp is that to show the sensibility is to show it in architecture. That's one of the things I thought was missing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There were a whole series of projects I would have shown. For example, Toyo Ito's Sendai project, I think, is a spectacular case of it. Many of Greg's projects, the Seijima projects that, for example, there are, if I were to come up here and try to show this, to give this lecture as a critic, that's what I would have done. But what I wanted to try to do was come up here and show my efforts to move from a resource which was non-architectural and take it into architecture. So I was just trying to show my design efforts. But you're absolutely right. And I'm not interested in the myth of sui generis. I look at projects. I'm really interested in seeing what other architects do. I borrow, steal, am influenced by, and this notion of liquidity or the possibility. For example, I knew deep in my heart that new minimalism, and particularly the way transparency is being rethought, is closely connected to a spatial idea that I'm interested in. But on the other hand, I was kind of rejecting its modern geometry. So I knew I liked it too much. So it took, to be able to think what was the similarity between, say what I was doing and what Sage and I was doing took me a while. But you're right, and I think a more thorough treatment of the subject would actually have to show that as an emergence condition in architecture.
May I just comment? I think I'm also very interested in the studio, and quite a few people are these kind of particle universes, which suddenly, and you started to add onto the certain qualities that these are spaces, media, which acquire materiality, a transparency, temporary hierarchies, and so on and so forth. And I think what worries me, so that is one thing where you expand the catalog, the formal catalog of spatial imagination, we could call it, but also we could start to call them tools. And whereas I'm getting worried to kind of rest with this notion of sensibility as a kind of guiding tool, which is for me always a kind of abbreviation, intuitive grasp of something which is also to be analyzed. And you have yourself been kind of calling for a new paradigm which would call for performativity and operational kind of analysis. And I wonder how, and some of these hints at transparency, materiality, hierarchies starting to establish, but then they give way again. These are kind of performances, formal performance of these kind of structures. And I like a lot that you started to build these kind of shells which experiment directly in space with these kind of structures and the way objects then rest within that, and what is the effect? Do they recognize an object, or do they dissolve? Do they become part of these particles, and so on and so forth? What I find, though, still missing, where it has not been redeemed fully, is how this new expansion of the catalog of spatial imagination and formal tools makes itself relevant to the kind of social changes, the institutional changes we're witnessing, the restructuring of society, which I see a lot of kind of correspondence with the kind of formal vocabularies, because there are also in other disciplines, especially even linguistics, you put to one side, if you talk about the kind of move from has always been rehearsed from structures and post-structure, it's precisely this kind of breaking free of the fixity of relationship, and you could nearly talk about language as a swarm of words which has a kind of structural and performative and operational and systems quality, rather than looking at the kind of semantics and so on. So I think that what we've started to look at is the social universe, which becomes like these scoop of fish, or require this kind of scoop of fish as one of its tools.
Let me say two things. One is I can trace exactly I know the Susan Sontag article. I used to teach it. I know it talks about new sensibilities, and until Charles mentioned it again tonight, I never had made the connection. But let me give you a brief history. The first time I ever heard the term sensibility in a way that I thought it caught my attention, because I know this essay. I mean, I teach the book. I never realized that she talked about it until I remembered it. It was Greg. Greg says, I'm not really interested in the production of new meanings. I'm interested in the production of new sensibilities. And I thought, well, all of a sudden, so I knew the notion of sensibility. It had never caught my attention until a certain point in time. And for me, even the interest in the idea of sensibility introduced a question of new sensibility. And then Deleuze connected it to the new. So, however, to answer your question, I don't take offense at this, because I mean this in a positive spirit. I'd heard that you asked Ed Soja, what good do your books do for anybody? And I thought, oh shit, he's going to ask me, what good do my buildings do for anybody? I mean, and in the sense of direct social performance. And I wrote the text that Michael read earlier about the political project of architecture being responsible for new social organizations, new institutional arrangements, and I still believe that. The question is, I then went back and looked, and this notion of architectural performance is a crucial question today. You can't look at Rem's work without it. You can't look at FOA Foreign Office of Architects. The aspiration for a directly performative infrastructural effect in architecture is, I still think, its greatest ambition. But I really think its true social effect has been indirect, and it is related to sensibility. So the answer to the point of introducing the question of new sensibility is that I think that's the answer to the question. I think if you truly look at the history of architecture, its most important performative have been in that regard. For example, let me give you one thing I've always said is there's never been a case in the history of architecture where the function of a building was the cause of the recognition of its architectural excellence. Never once. There's no instance in which an extremely well-functioning building was so well-functioning that we valorize it as architecture. And that's a kind of funny thing, considering that not only is function important, we call it period functionalism. I mean, a classic example is the tuberculosis center of Alto. It never cured it. It is a great work of architecture, but nobody holds it responsible for its project in relationship to curing people with tuberculosis. And in the same way, I'm interested in fashion, not because I think fashion I think fashion effects are underestimated. They're powerful political, social effects. So I believe that the performative is crucial, but I think you have to figure out what is a performance in architecture.
Just maybe a tiny thing on that, on the question of sensibility. I mean, I think just on this last point, when you were giving the example of this relationship between the social and the architectural. I mean, I think if you leave this territory of things like the attempt on the part of modernism, but just look more at certain anonymous, everyday, and so on and so forth pieces of building, then you could reframe, I think, your question of sensibility and see that in terms of many moments in the history of architecture, there have been situations where certain spatialities have had phenomenal effect in terms of the way that people have actually occupied those spaces in terms of the kind of sensibility.
I don't think there's any doubt about that.
I think
Uffizi is a great example.
Okay, or I think in terms of just simply because of the fact that I was reading, just in terms of the piece that Evans wrote on the figures, doors, passages, in terms of comparing like 16th century space of domesticity with 19th century space of domesticity, and looking at the relationship between rooms in one and the idea of many doors in a room versus the notion of the single door in a space. So some little things, in a sense, are part and parcel of certain cultural conditions that then also produce certain specific spatialities. Now, one of the things that I think is a question is that at the beginning of the presentation you were talking about Roberto Unger, and I sort of later on kind of tried to find out whatever happened to Roberto Unger, because I think one of the things that for me is interesting about the work of Unger is where he talks about the moment at which architects have a certain kind of responsibility through their imaginings to produce conditions that will in fact raise in others the possibility of imagining different social conditions. So it's actually something that's produced through architecture itself, through its own spatialities. In other words, architecture thinks in ways that is not to do with an idea of a kind of behavioral situation, but circumstances, situations, and conditions. Now, I wonder if one wanted to do that project, if one went from the idea of analysis. In one sense, you can see the idea of trying to visualize certain sensibilities and then translate those to certain architectural propositions. I have to ask this question, whether you don't think that this is forever a kind of doomed project, because the space of translation between the analysis, between the visuality that one wants to see and the idea of its architectural equivalence is so short. It is such a limited gap, in a sense, that bridging, by definition, brings about a kind of semiotic project. Whether you want it or not, you're always having to say, this is kind of that. This is liquid. There is very little, in a sense, between the kind of liquidity of the plan and the idea that it actually now has, for example, certain curvatures that can be used in order to make this kind of reference.
That's right.
So I wonder, in a sense, if the project of Unger is not a kind of different project than the one that you're presenting. It's not the modernism of analysis and then the project, but it is something where it has to really find within certain much more invisible conditions of everyday practice the possibility of an architecture that might not appear so quickly in some way. I would just think that it would be a harder project in a way. It will, or not maybe harder.
Yeah.
It's not. It would just be a kind of
Yeah, I know.
more
You should
problematic
work. You know,
project.
should it should be look more tortured. So let me say three things. First of all, I tried to acknowledge the priority and perhaps even the greater depth of a situationist approach. And I don't mean simply Guy Debord and Derive, but simply paying attention to a situation and discovering in the intrinsic qualities of it new experiences that you can then reify in. And that's not semiotic. I still think it's the most important tradition. I think it's actually the most productive. I tried to acknowledge that, and I tried to acknowledge it because I'm not part of it. I come out of Colin Rowe through formal. I come out of a completely different thing, and in assessing that and still maintaining an affection for it in process, I recognize a superiority of a situational approach. However, I think one has to be careful about architectural's attention to what is the architecture of a situation. For example, large span meeting rooms in medieval architecture were primarily made possible not by architects but by the development of the flue. The flue allowed an internal chimney so you could heat a large space. Now, that's not an innovation that belongs to architecture. So architecture is quick to claim all developments in the world of building as if they were architectural. And I think you have to be a little careful of that. So I'm suspicious of situational capturing of devices that really don't belong to the architecture. But the other thing I tried to say is this emergent phenomenon, which is more related to fashion, constantly underestimated. And not non-semiotic, but the notion of pointing that Unger uses as opposed to reference, so that it draws from without embarrassment, but nevertheless tries to encode, is an important and under-regarded phenomena in architecture, and I think collaborates with. So you're absolutely right. You'll be in a desperate race to stay ahead of it all along. And I think, for me, it keeps architectural fresh as a cultural practice. So I agree with everything you say, except I don't underestimate the sort of a kind of facile effort to capture a moment that you see, recognize it as an emergent condition, translate it into both material and form, never violate the real. Stay with, because the criticism I have of Greg's work is that it drifts to the irreal. Not that it should, or not that but our an important body of work in architectural history has been relegated to the irrelevant by being called expressionist. We know this. This development of a category to contain threatening work is, in my opinion, the development of a category to protect us from the effects of the irreal. So, it's a sophisticated argument. So in every way, I agree with what you say, except for the last part, and that is, you believe that the priority of the situation over emergent sensibility, and even though emergent sensibilities are short-lived and quickly give way to coding, to being able to be decoded and recoded, it is actually, for me, the most vital part of the life of the architecture. You should look at the history of the design process for the Guggenheim Museum. It's not true that Frank Lloyd Wright had the idea and developed it. What's true is he went through a series of at one point it was upside down. The cone was at the bottom. At one point he turned it into a trapezoid. At one point he didn't know if the interior should be a void or not. So it's actually he solves the problem of what I believe to be one of the great building, one of the most important buildings in 20th century architecture, not by the situational condition, but by examining
I also
the
want to agree
sensibility.
with you. But I think it's important again not to turn the situational into something which is a representational condition. Nobody says you see the situation and then you're trying to somehow make a representation of that particular situation.
You try to capture the space, the authenticity of the discovered space in the project.
Sure. Let's get somebody else. So that there's a question there. There's a question there.
Just a couple.
And then
I'm tired. I'm old. I'm hungry.
My question is somewhat more brief. In your investigations of swarming and hiving, did you study the mathematics of it?
Yes. Yes, I did.
And what did you learn from that? Because you didn't mention
I
it.
learned
You
the
showed us the video.
I mean, I'm not being glib. I'm quite good at mathematics. I was able to read it and understand it in a few days. It's not very difficult. And I can tell you, if you would like to know, the difference between a thermodynamic collection and a swarm or a hive is the differential equations at the edge. Basically, it's this. If you throw out a lot of particles in a thermodynamic, they will distribute statistically. But because fish and bats and these elements like to not only stay a certain distance away from, but stay a certain distance close to, they produce that edge that makes the dynamic form. And it's what enables them to adjust quickly to contingencies. It's why there's always a hierarchy in the swarm, but the hierarchy can move. So there's no leader. It's the form, the mathematics of the dynamics that produces the leader. It's quite an interesting notion of hierarchy, and it exists in the differential equations. It's actually quite easy. So the answer was yes. Useless to me. I couldn't figure out how to do anything with it in the design, but I did learn it.
Charles Jenks has just left. About a year and a half ago, he gave a lecture on
Yeah, I was
complexity.
there.
And we saw the bifurcation of rabbit breeding.
Yeah, it turned
and how
into a
that
kitchen table.
became a chest of drawers. Now, this evening we've seen this sort of mathematics that's inherent
No,
in
no,
a school
I-
of fish, and we see it become a school of shelving units.
Yeah.
But I kind of
Better.
quite like
Come on, you
the
got to tell
shelving
me though.
unit.
You don't see the difference between.
Well, I was going to say I quite like the shelving unit.
And you
Right?
don't like that? You
tested-
didn't like
you
his,
tested the chest of drawers. Now, what are your comments on the fact that
Because
both
Charles
these diagrams are
uses
taken in?
Charles uses the scientific. He likes the images, and uses them as ornaments. Whatever he does, he takes. What Charles does is makes ornaments out of signs. You know, what I do is much more subtle and sophisticated.
You were singing the praises of his garden before he left.
I told all my friends, you know, this is the night where everybody's going to say, Jeff lost it just like Charles Jenks lost it a year and a half. I thought that his lecture, I love Charles. I like all that stuff, but it made me feel bad. You know, because you take a diagram from a science magazine and you turn it into an ornament, you know, and I've done that a lot. So I was interested in see if you could make a sense. I mean, for example, you can't see through his cabinet, so you can see through my shelves. I mean, they perform more stuff than simply symbolizing the diagram, I claim. That's it, though. Not much more. Yeah, I don't have a theory. You know, I have two parts. I have a documentary and a sitcom. Yeah. Sorry.
I mean, one thing that's really, I think, extremely strong about the shelving is that the particular form or the style or the language of any one of the arrangements can't be localized or repeated. But that what's the important aspect is positionality and adjacency.
Mhm.
And so I think the move from, I mean, you can't put those two things together, I think. Charles's kitchen table, which is based on a sign or a form maybe that's
Yeah,
not
a form,
representing anything.
yeah.
But I mean, your argument about the swarm and the flock is about a certain kind of arrangement. And when you say you'll take, revival of modernism or organic form or whatever, I mean, it's not as important the shape as it is the positionality and
Yeah,
arrangement.
exactly.
Which means you can move from furniture design to urban design, and you're really doing arrangements. You're not really doing
That's right.
forms. And I think that's probably the strength of the argument.
You know what? I find the shelving, I like them, but I find them embarrassingly lyrical. I like the urbanism, but I recognize exactly what Moisen says is all I was able to do there is make certain kinds of shapes, even in the first model, even in the model that I was most attached to. The work I like the best, I liked Kansai, but when I didn't win, I started to hate it.
But I mean, honestly,
it's the posters, frankly, that I think are the
posters
best.
No, I mean, it's an incredible innovation in graphic design that you don't care what font it is. Because
Well,
when you were
yeah.
telling me about your posters, I thought, I wonder what fonts he's using.
Yeah,
And
you
then
don't
when
lay
I saw
any-
the posters, it doesn't matter what fonts they are at all. All that matters is the position of the
Right.
fonts in space.
Thank you for recognizing that. Orange, go ahead. Nice color.
Sorry, Jeff. Just a brief
Oh,
question.
come on, let a kid do it.
Yeah, sure.
Ask a harder question.
What I wanted to ask, bring up Charles Jenks again. When you mentioned putting the model of your project in your backyard, I wanted to ask, what sort of problems you ran up against in the construction of the work, if it was structural or if it was economic,
Well,
or what it was, and how would that represent?
You mean what problems did I run to in Bangkok, or
Well,
what?
tied together. What sort of problems did you run into in Bangkok?
I called the landscape engineer over and I showed him the drawings and the model, and he said, it doesn't look like a garden, it looks like a country. I don't know yet. I'm in the middle of it. It's. I think it will not be financial because it's basically, instead of doing a concrete gridded patio, it's an unusually shaped grid, and there are fissures in there to get the light in, but I don't really, and the figuring out where you plant versus where you build the concrete. I think landscape design, I got to tell you, is where it's at. If I were y'all, I think Moisen is brilliant for doing a landscape program. There's not another interesting one in the world. Landscape architects are no good at it. There's very few that are any good at it. When Martha Schwartz and Adrian Gruss, with no discredit to either one of them, are the top innovators in their field, it's wide open. And I tell you something else, you affect major changes in political space with landscape with very little resistance. For some reason, minor changes in a building elicit incredible resistance, but there's very little resistance to I'm doing poster design and landscape, that's it, but are you,
We need a good one for next.
I think it's an incredible opportunity. So I don't know yet.
Two small questions.
Yeah, just very briefly, Jeff, because you haven't mentioned it tonight. I'm wondering if you might say something about your writing, actually. I mean, you've talked about sensibility in terms of... well, you've talked about the sensibility in terms of space, and I'm wondering if there's a kind of textual sensibility that either you align, if it's affected the way you write, because you seem to argue for a kind of new architecture recently in a very different way than you did a few years ago.
Yeah.
It kind of connects to the work.
I don't have any consistency in my writing. I mean, I still like that essay that, and I still...
The new architecture.
I read it and I think, I'm glad I said this stuff. And I think that book is pretty good. I mean, that folding book, despite the fact that, for lots of reasons, AD somehow is able to screw up everything they touch, and they manage to screw that up too. But in the last few weeks, two essays have been coming out. I think I'll just mention them briefly. One is on Rem Koolhaas in the Croquis, and one is just about to come out in the next Croquis on Peter Eisenman. And in that, I'm experimenting with two forms of criticism. One is a kind of deadpan Frampton approach. So if you read the Croquis on Rem, I'm hoping to bore you to death, because in a certain sense, I'm tired of culturally interesting writing that doesn't really say anything about the work. So one of the things I appreciate about Frampton, even if I disagree with his approach to architecture, is that he speaks only to architects. He's not interested in interesting a lot of people. The other one was it's a damning critique, I think, of Peter. At one point, he refused to publish it, even though it praises the building, because I use a language which I think is about visceral sensibility. And I basically say his building looks like a dead harlequin with dissected organs, and I try to make the descriptive language as sensible as the building. So I don't know which way to go yet, but I know that the state of architectural criticism and writing now is in a really bad state.
There isn't a kind of flocking. I mean, there isn't a kind of flocking
Nah.
textual operation like the spatial.
I tell you, they have a thing called the College of Critics in Japan. And every critic who's lost it gets invited. So it's Frampton's on it, Colquhoun's on it, Dennis Sharp's on it, Charles is on it. Last year I got invited. So that's why I'm switching to this stuff. This guy's bright, I was so I was so glad to hear his questions today because I don't know him. I guess he's graduate design, but I thought he reads a project differently. So each generation needs to begin that way. And let's say Peter did it. He read Colin Road differently, and then we began to read that differently, and Greg began to read that differently. And you always worry, can there be anything else? And then obviously every once in a while you hear somebody just say something that you'd never thought about a project. And I don't know. I'm sorry to do this to you.
Maybe I shouldn't have said.
Probably. But I felt really good about hearing you today, and I just wanted to thank you. Yeah. Now, say something about my work.
I've got a question about this.
Is that microphone on? Yeah, it is.
Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question about this flocking idea. If you've got a flock of zebras, the way they're designed, the stripe design actually completely confuses the whole, and it all turns into one thing really. So my question is, and that goes along with that notion of sensibility, which you could actually subtract from the actual object. It's sensibility in a certain way isn't something that much attachable to the object, if not rather.
Yeah, I think. That's what Greg was
there's something we had here before. So
it's the organization. You don't really.
Yeah, so form doesn't really matter anymore because it's just an organizational question. So I wonder about your preoccupation with forms. If you,
I don't think it's true that form doesn't matter anymore. I think we have to give up a notion of form in this. I think Greg, he said it. We have to stop thinking of form as ideal static form, and we have to recognize that that's actually never been form. Form is the relationship between material and a context through force, let's say. So form for me is now each moment, a school of fish, every form they take. So there's no such thing as the form in the sense of a square or a cube. The form is the school of fish. It's no longer the shape. Now you're asking me, why am I attentive to shape? And the answer is because it still has an enormous power in architecture. It does. And if you look at each of those little shelf pieces, they're really boring. They're completely, I entered a competition. You had to show pictures, but you had to technically draw all the pieces. And I don't know if you saw Hudsucker Proxy, but they technically drew the circle in plan. That's what this thing looked like. It's just a circle in plan and elevation. So I think really think you have to respect and recognize how architecture produces effects, and one of those ways is in shape. But you never leave your learning. I studied. I didn't really study, but I hung around with Peter Eisenman. I hung around with shape makers, and I recognized finally that their work had a limit that I was no longer that I had lost not interest in it, but it was no longer driving my thinking. And so I shifted to organization.